Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to PhilosoHour,
the show where we dedicate a few minutes of our time to significant ponderings of the philosophical variety and then think about how they relate to a current event.
In today's specially extended episode, we will be discussing a truly controversial take on addiction, the brain disease model of addiction, and whether fellow philosophical peers are convinced by a popular argument.
To begin, let's define the brain disease model of addiction. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, addiction is defined as, quote, a chronic relapsing brain disease that is characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite harmful consequences, end quote. The American Society of Addiction Medicine has also described addiction as, quote, chronic brain disease, end quote.
The evidence cited for this view includes research on neurobiological changes in the brains of addicted animals and humans, and the genetics of addiction liability. Despite authoritative support, this definition is controversial. For example, philosophers of medicine have debated statistical rarity, degree of social impairment, biological dysfunction, and decreased evolutionary fitness, all as criteria used to determine what constitutes a disease. Yet, none appear to be a sufficient support.
Chief amongst the skeptics is neuroscientist and former addict Marc Lewis. Lewis highly disagrees with this model for both neuroscientific and comparatively logical reasons. For Lewis, addiction is not a brain disease. However, it is important to first define our background assumptions before entering further into debate. If we are to argue whether or not addiction is a disease, we must identify what diseases are. Lewis determines that, based on the assumption that physical and mental illnesses are the same sorts of things, diseases are harmful evolutionary dysfunctions.
Evolutionary dysfunctions are those defined in a backwards-looking manner. In order to figure out whether something is functioning, we must ask, is this mechanism doing what it evolved to do?
For example, the left ventricle of the heart evolved to pump blood throughout the body. If someone is born with or develops a left ventricle that cannot properly pump blood throughout the body, it is likely that person has some sort of disease related to the heart. Now that we have defined disease, let's walk through Lewis's argument against addiction as a brain disease. The first three premises are: number 1, addiction is a disease only if it is evolutionarily dysfunctional. Number 2, the brain disease model requires addiction to be a chronic substance-related disease. And number 3, addicts do not often report their experience of addiction as chronic or as removing their free will.
The first two premises can be explained by the evolutionary dysfunction model and the brain disease model, or BDM. If addiction fails to uphold the requirements for disease as previously defined, it cannot be a disease. Next, Lewis states which type of disease the BDM defines addiction as: chronic and substance-related. The third premise relies on primary accounts from actual addicts to disprove the BDM's definition of addiction. Addicts do not see their addictions as chronic.
For example, if someone wanted to be a track star but had a chronic, untreatable heart disease that inhibited them from running, the disease inhibits his free will because there is nothing that person can do to stop the disease and become a track star. However, if someone addicted to smoking wanted to become a saxophone player but did not have the lung capacity to play due to a smoke inhalation, they could eventually stop smoking and recover to a point where playing the saxophone is possible, even though the process is often extremely hard. Unlike the heart disease, stopping the problem is physically possible. This, Lewis argues, is what makes addiction not chronic. The next two premises are: number 4, addiction is characterized by neurological changes in pursuit of goal state, fill in the blank according to the addiction, such as dopamine levels for hard drugs. And number 5, habits are characterized by neurological changes in pursuit of goal states. Goal states meaning the highest level of attainment or satisfaction.
Here, Lewis is arguing against a point made by Stephen Hyman, previous director of the National Institute of Mental Health, that because addiction changes the way the brain works, just like the way diabetes changes the way the pancreas works, it must also be considered disease. Lewis argues that neurological changes alone are not indicators of dysfunction, and that addiction actually changes the brain works in very normal ways.
In his article, Addiction and the Brain, Develop but Not Disease, Lewis states, quote, "One of the key premises of the disease model is that addiction changes the brain. Yet, brains are supposed to change. They are designed to change. In fact, the stages of child and adolescent development and the learning that goes on throughout childhood are all underpinned by changes in the cortex and limbic regions. How then should we characterize brain changes that occur naturally?" Page 9. Lewis then goes on to use habits as another example of naturally occurring changes in the brain.
He says, quote, "Since we need stability in our precepts, concepts, and actions, brain changes almost always settle into habits, and once formed, habits, even minor habits, remain in place, sometimes for the rest of our lives. New synaptic pathways and corresponding patterns of thought and behavior start off tentative and fluctuating, but after they've been activated repeatedly, fledgling pathways get more entrenched, more concretized." Page 10.
In other words, cells that fire together wire together. In some ways, addiction appears to be a very bad habit. Although it is one that is destructive and severely hard to overcome, this doesn't mean its effects are abnormal to the brain. In fact, there's actually a word in the scientific community used to describe the fundamental idea that the brain changes: neuroplasticity.
By this reasoning, a drug addict's brain is different from someone who has never touched a drug in his life. Different experiences will yield different effects on the brain.
The final four premises use the example of falling in love and habit formation to further support the conclusion. Number 6. Love is characterized by neurological changes in pursuit of goal states. Number 7. Love and habits are parts of normal learning. Number 8. Normal learning is characterized by neurological changes in pursuit of goal states. Number 9. Addiction is an outcome of normal learning, and hence not an evolutionary dysfunction, leading to the conclusion of number 10, addiction is not a disease. Love, Lewis explains, has striking similarities with addiction, such as increased levels of dopamine, which make lovers more focused on one another and have the tendency to regard each other as unique. If you've ever said something along the lines of, "You're the cutest," or "You're the most beautiful person in the world," you know what I'm talking about. This aspect, along with the common currency of wanting, as well as other neurological stimuli, make the changes that occur to a brain in love almost identical to a brain on drugs. So if you think addiction is a disease, then apparently so is love?
Well, Lewis doesn't think so. Like habits, addiction, and love appear to be subjects of normal changeability within the brain, also known as normal learning. Thus, addiction is not a disease. Lewis is convincing because he uses both neuroscientific and comparatively logical reasons to explain his argument. Science is an effective form of evidence that is hard to argue against, especially when his examples of the effects of habits and love on the brain, things that are both decidedly not diseases or addictions, are so similar to the effects of addiction on the brain.
Lewis is also a PhD and former addict, so he is an expert on both fronts of the situation. Further, his argument is logical because he defeats the BDM in a structurally sound way. The BDM claims addiction is a chronic disease. Lewis gives a variety of evidence to disprove that claim through scientific observations about what is happening in the brain when addiction occurs and how those effects and processes do not match that claim. But how is addiction is what we evolved to do and not a mental disorder convincing, you might ask?
Saying addiction is what we evolved to do sounds a bit grim when put that way. Rather, the convincing part is that addiction is a natural reaction to certain stimuli on our brains. This argument is still convincing because behavior related to addiction is commonly seen in many facets of our daily lives. Binge watching a Netflix show, wanting to be around your loved ones, scrolling through TikTok or Instagram. Our brains are wired to react a certain way when we are exposed to certain stimuli. So it is not too unbelievable to think that a more intense stimuli like cocaine, heroin, alcohol could yield a more intense reaction.
So, does this view change our view about the degree to which addicts are responsible for the behavior? Depending on your perspective, the answer can be either yes or no. According to Lewis, the answer is yes. He thinks a disease model boasts the assumption that there is nothing an addict can personally do to stop their addiction, and thus relies solely on medical professionals for a cure. Rather than assume some responsibility, it takes away an addict's sense of agency, empowerment, personal growth, and self-understanding in overcoming addiction. Other philosophically minded peers of the medical world partially agree with these assumptions as well. For example, Hannah Picard agrees that addiction is not a disease, but thinks that we should still regard addiction as a choice. However hard it is for addicts to control their use, she says, and however important it is for others to recognize and respect the struggle, addicts are not, in fact, compelled to use, but have the choice over their consumption in many circumstances. Further, the process of overcoming addiction oneself, as suggested by Lewis, presupposes that addicts have a choice and a degree of control. Philosophers Lily Frank and Saskia Nagel, on the other hand, take a slightly more morally persuaded middle ground. To them, it appears that if addiction is a disease, then there is no place for self-control or choice. And if addiction is a matter of choice, then addicts are held fully responsible for it. Instead of either 0% or 100% responsibility, Frank and Nagel suggest establishment of a healthy middle ground, one that assumes some level of responsibility without completely moralizing addiction, or defining it as a right or wrong choice. In other words, approaching addiction as something that has some choice but comes with immense struggles and consequences that make the choices eventually seem impossible.
The stance appears especially convincing because it delves into moral responsibility. Taking heroin, for example, is usually not the right choice per se, but it's a level of addictiveness that doesn't leave its user much choice to correct their error very easily. Further, if that person were forced to take heroin, then it is less likely that they are morally responsible for their addiction too.
Further, there are degrees to which addiction affects certain people. For example, family genetics that make somebody more likely to be a violent drunk might make an addiction to alcohol more severe for one person than another. In one case, having a violence-inducing alcohol addiction may seem immoral if it causes you to harm your family because it is objectively wrong, while in another case, having a harmless alcohol addiction isn't objectively right or wrong.
So, then how can we say with confidence whether addiction is morally right or morally wrong? Well, what do you think of Lewis's argument? Is addiction a disease? Are addicts morally responsible for their actions? These are the complicated questions that we must consider for this topic. Well, thanks for listening and hope to see you next time. This has been PhilosoHour.